My mother-in-law stole my house while I was recovering from surgery, then had the nerve to claim she was helping, but she never expected me to fight back. My husband Jake and I purchased our house 5 years ago with my grandfather's legacy. Jake had horrible credit due to college debts, so the deed was exclusively in my name. It was a little 4-bedroom home, but it was ideal for beginning a family, which we had been planned since we married. Helen, Jake's mother, had been a nightmare from day one. Jake was constantly claiming he married down, because I was a nurse, and she wanted him to marry his ex, a lawyer. She especially despised the fact that I owned the house, but Jake did not. She continued telling everyone Jake was living in his wife's house like a kept man. When I became pregnant, Helen became quite interested in our living circumstances. She began throwing suggestions about how we needed a larger space for the baby, how the area was not nice enough, and how her buddy was a broker who could get us a good bargain. I assured her we were perfectly content with where we were. The nursery had already been painted, the home had been paid off, and we didn't need a mortgage with a baby on the way. That infuriated her because it reminded her that I had purchased the house outright. Something Jake couldn't have done. 1 month before my due date, Helen began showing up at Jake's job, bringing odd individuals she said were friends who wanted to view the property. I thought that was strange, but pregnant brain left me too weary to protest. She'd take them around each room, pointing out things she'd alter, and spoke about the home as if she knew everything about it. She then requested to borrow my house keys so that she could drop off baby goods while we were at work. Jake thought it was nice that his mother wanted to assist. I handed her the spare key. A big error. Helen persuaded Jake, 4 weeks before my due date, that I needed to include him in the deed before the baby arrived, claiming that it would safeguard our kid if something happened to me during delivery. She actually printed up deed transfer paperwork and delivered them to us. Jake was perplexed since he assumed his name was already on it. I reiterated his credit position from when we acquired it. Helen seemed surprised, saying that was so long ago that it didn't matter now. She kept pushing until I said we'd talk about it once the kid was born. Labor started quickly. My water broke at 2 a.m., and Jake rushed me to the hospital. I was in labor for 40 hours. Helen had Jake's phone at the moment since he was so focused on me. She often left the room to reportedly inform family members. She was really messaging from Jake's phone, while managing something altogether unrelated. Our daughter was delivered healthily, but I had a hemorrhage and required emergency surgery. Helen informed Jake while I was asleep that he needed to go home and retrieve my insurance cards from my desk because the hospital required them. It was a lie. The hospital already had everything. Helen remained in my room throughout Jake's absence. She looked through my handbag, found my driver's ID and social security card, and photographed everything. She also had Jake's phone data. 2 days later, when I was still healing and learning to breastfeed, a woman arrived in my hospital room with paperwork. She claimed she was from the title business and needed me to sign some adjustments to the deed transfer to include Jake's name. I was on pain medication, weary, and had just fed the baby, and Helen was standing right there, repeating everything we had talked. She said the lawyer made a mistake and listed the transfer date as that day, rather than 5 years ago when we purchased it. I was so out of it that I signed where she pointed, but it didn't add Jake to my deed. It was handing the house exclusively to Jake. Helen had previously arranged for Jake to sign documents the day before when he returned home, explaining that it was power of attorney paperwork for my medical choices. 7 days after giving birth, we returned home to discover our locks changed and a sold sign in the yard. Helen stood in the driveway with a man she introduced as the new owner. She stated Jake had sold the house because we wanted a bigger space for the baby. She'd orchestrated the entire operation, using photographs of my paperwork to fake initial agreements, having Jake inadvertently sign the sale papers, and selling my property for cash to her friend's kid for half its worth. Lucas, the buyer, was standing there grinning, with builders ready to begin modifications. Jake was extremely perplexed, claiming he had never promised to sell anything. Helen stated that he signed the documents and that she, as his mother, facilitated everything. She genuinely suggested that I praise her for managing things when I was being theatrical at the hospital. I phoned the police, but they stated it was a civil problem because paperwork had been signed. Lucas said all of the documentation was valid, and we had 48 hours to get our belongings out. Helen had already rented us a 1-bedroom apartment across town, which she claimed would teach us gratitude. She continued emphasizing that young people didn't need to buy homes anyhow. Helen messed up here. Lucas wasn't simply her friend's son. He was a contractor who had lost his license 3 years prior for fraud. I'm standing in my driveway with my 5-day-old daughter, and this grinning stranger tells me I have 48 hours to get out of my own home. Jake is hurriedly contacting the police again, and I can hear Helen in the background saying we should be thankful she got us an apartment, as if she did us a favor by stealing my house. My daughter starts weeping, and I attempt to calm her down as Lucas continues to explain how all of the documentation is legal and binding. He's acting as if this is simply business, as if he had no idea what he was doing when he paid half the worth of my property to a lady who had no right to sell it. The contractors have already begun measuring the living room windows, and I can see them staring at me as if I am the issue, as if I am some insane woman who refuses to go. Jake eventually gets through to the police dispatcher, who says someone will be out within an hour. Helen approaches and attempts to touch the infant, and I really back away from her. She appears to be harmed, but I am no longer concerned. She just snatched my house and is behaving as if I am being nasty to her. Lucas provides Jake a printed timetable of when we need to get our belongings out and what will happen if we do not comply. My legs feel weak, so I sit down on the front steps because I'm just 6 days post-surgery and shouldn't be standing for so long. The baby is still sobbing, and I need to feed her, but I won't do it in front of these folks. Jake comes down next to me, wraps his arm around my shoulders, and I can feel him shivering. He keeps apologizing, saying he had no clue what his mother was doing, and that he believed he was signing medical documents. I trust him because Jake is bad at reading legal paperwork, and Helen knows this. She had spent his entire life doing things for him and instructing him what to sign. When one of the contractors approaches and asks if we need help transporting boxes to a truck, Jake instructs him to leave us alone. The guy backs off, but I can see they're all waiting for us to go so they can begin ripping down my house. The cops come and spend 30 minutes going over all of the documents Lucas brought. And the officer ultimately tells us that it appears to be legally binding, despite the fact that we had no intention of selling. He's looking at the signatures, dates, and title transfer paperwork and shaking his head, as if he's seen this before but he can't do anything about it. Lucas stands there with his arms crossed, appearing confident, while Helen lingers around, attempting to explain that she was only assisting us in making a sound financial decision. The police asks if I signed the documents, and I explain that I was in the hospital for 7 days after giving birth, receiving pain medicine and undergoing emergency surgery. He asks Jake whether he signed anything, and Jake gives him the documents Helen handed him, which he assumed were medical power of authority. The officer says this is certainly a civil case, and we should get a lawyer right now because it is more than just a property dispute. He proposes that we document everything and submit a complaint with the district attorney's office for potential fraud. My hands are trembling so much that I can hardly grasp my phone to begin searching for lawyers. The officer hands us a card for legal aid services and tells us to call them first thing Monday morning. It's Saturday afternoon, and I realize we have the entire weekend to deal with this nightmare before we can even attempt to solve it. Lucas asks the officer whether he can proceed with the improvements, and the officer responds that the transaction is lawful as far as he knows. So I start weeping again, and so does the baby, and Jake tries to speak to the officer about fraud and forgery, but the officer simply says we need a lawyer. Helen really attempts to embrace me, but I shove her away so forcefully that she stumbles. Jake shouts at his mother to go, and she appears confused, as if she doesn't understand why we're furious with her. The officer asks if there would be a problem, and Jake answers, "No, we're leaving. We just need time to get our belongings." Lucas adds we just have 48 hours, no longer. The police officer goes, and we're standing there with Helen, Lucas and the contractors, and I feel like I'm in a bad dream where nothing makes sense. Jake's sister calls after hearing what occurred, and she is outraged with Helen, stating their mother has always been controlling, but this goes too far. Her name is Laura, and she's phoning because one of Helen's neighbors seen the police at our house and informed her that something was wrong. Jake puts her on speaker, and Laura yells that Helen has always been deceitful. But this is real fraud, and she may go to jail. Laura asks whether we have a lawyer, and Jake responds, "No, we just found out an hour ago." Laura adds her friend had a property issue last year and engaged an attorney called Clara Stone, who was fantastic in real estate fraud cases. She's sending me Clara's number while we're still on the phone, asking me to call right now rather than waiting until Monday. I contact Clara's workplace before we even complete our talk with Laura. The phone rings 4 times, and I believe it will go to voicemail. But then somebody picks up. A female announces, "This is Clara Stone's office," and I just start talking, explaining everything in this rushed, panicked voice about the hospital and the signatures and coming home to find our house sold. She stops me and says, "Clara is actually in the office finishing up some weekend work and can see us in an hour if we can get there." I quickly agree, and she gives me the address. Jake is already placing the baby in her car seat, and we're leaving our house while Lucas and his workmen are measuring and planning their improvements. Clara meets with us that afternoon at her office, and I'm still in my baggy pregnancy clothing, spit up on my shoulder, and attempting to nurse discreetly throughout the appointment. Her workplace is modest but well organized, with paperwork neatly arranged on all surfaces and legal volumes decorating the walls. Clara is about 40 years old, has short dark hair and wears spectacles. She has a concentrated attitude that makes me believe she is paying attention. She examines each document with extreme care and repeatedly returns to the chronology, asking precise questions about who had access to what information and when. She wants to know when Helen requested for the home keys, when she started bringing people in, when the hospital paperwork was signed, and everything. Jake and I take turns explaining, while Clara takes notes in this really exact handwriting. She requests to see the paperwork I signed at the hospital, so I show her the images I snapped with my phone before we left the house. Clara focuses attention on the signature, date, and witness line. She asks who saw my signing, and I tell the title company representative and Helen. Clara's eyes sharpen and she asks whether I was on pain medicine, to which I respond yes, along with being weary after 40 hours of labor. She questions Jake about the paperwork he signed, and he also gives her images of those. Clara lays out all of the paperwork on her desk and begins comparing signatures and dates, and I can feel her curiosity increasing as the fraud pattern becomes clear. She inquires about Lucas, and I inform her that he is an unlicensed contractor who lost his license for fraud 3 years ago. Clara genuinely grins for the first time and adds, "That's very helpful information." She asks how we found out, and Jake explains his sister Laura knows someone who formerly worked with Lucas. Clara says she wants to conduct a comprehensive background check on Lucas and the title business official who visited the hospital. Clara adds that the falsified signatures and my drugged state are grounds for canceling the deal. But we must act quickly since Lucas has already begun modifications, which will become more difficult to reverse with each passing day. She is discussing filing an emergency request for a temporary restraining order to prevent any alterations to the property while we fight the sale in court. She says, "The fact that I was in the hospital recovering from surgery and on medication makes the signature questionable at best. The fact that Jake thought he was signing medical papers and not sale documents is also important." She asks if we have any proof that Helen had access to our personal documents, and I tell her about giving her the spare key and leaving her alone in my hospital room. Clara claims it is circumstantial yet useful. She inquires about our money and whether we can afford to fight this. Jake and I gaze at each other. I tell her we have some funds, but not much, and I'm meant to be on maternity leave for another 8 weeks. Clara says she'll work with us on payment arrangements, but the most important thing right now is to prevent Lucas from doing any more work on the property. She files an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order while we are seated in her office. She is typing quickly, looking up legal precedents and describing what she is doing as she goes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I feel like someone is truly fighting for us rather than simply telling us we're screwed. Clara says the hearing will probably be in 3 or 4 days, so we need to document everything Lucas does to the house between now and then. She instructs us to drive by and snap pictures every several hours, if feasible. She also advises we should gather all of the paperwork Helen has given us concerning the house. Every text message, email, and everything. Jake claims the most of it is on his phone, and Clara asks that it all be forwarded to her immediately. While waiting for the court hearing, Clara's investigator investigates Lucas's history and learns that he lost his contractor license after scamming 4 clients out of more than $250,000. Aaron, the investigator, contacts Clara 3 days after our initial meeting to provide information. Clara calls and puts Aaron on speaker. Aaron reveals that 5 years ago Lucas had a contracting firm and accepted deposits from 4 separate households for big improvements. He completed some preliminary work before disappearing with their money. The family sued and won, but Lucas declared bankruptcy, so they never received anything. The state has withdrawn his contractor license, and he is not permitted to perform any contractual work. Aaron believes this is significant since it demonstrates a habit of deception and targeting vulnerable individuals. The detective discovers Zachary Hale, Lucas's old business partner who was duped in the prior scheme. Zachary is more than eager to reveal evidence of Lucas's deceptive tactics and history of targeting vulnerable persons. Aaron claims Zachary phoned him back within an hour of being contacted and had boxes of documentation from their company together. Zachary wants Lucas to face actual repercussions this time. Clara believes Zachary's testimony might be critical to our case since it demonstrates that Lucas understands precisely what he's doing when he takes advantage of others. She asks whether we're comfortable with her contacting Zachary directly, and we answer yes, certainly. Aaron also offers us Zachary's contact information in case we wish to chat to him ourselves. Jake contacts Zachary that night, and they speak for over an hour. Zachary informs Jake that Lucas particularly targets people in crisis circumstances because they are too stressed to read paperwork attentively. He cheated 4 families and is now doing it to us. Zachary claims he lost his life savings in Lucas's prior swindle and has been waiting for an opportunity to see him face the penalties. Helen shows up abruptly in our tight apartment with baby necessities, as if nothing is wrong. We've been in this little one-bedroom home for 4 days and are still living out of boxes. The doorbell rings, and I glance through the peephole to find Helen standing there with shopping bags. I don't want to allow her in, but Jake is in the shower. The baby is wailing, and I'm too weary to deal with it. I open the door, and Helen strides in as if she owns the place. She begins unpacking the luggage and takes out diapers, baby clothing and formula despite the fact that I am still nursing. She's commenting about how nice and comfortable the flat is. And aren't we happy she discovered it for us? When Jake confronts her about the house, she appears perplexed and upset that we are being ungrateful. He comes out of the bathroom in sweatpants with his hair still damp, sees his mother, and simply freezes. Helen grins and tells him she has brought provisions for the baby. Jake wonders what she's doing here, and Helen explains she came to check on her granddaughter. Helen is taken aback when Jake tells her that she must go. She truly believes we are overreacting, that young couples do not need to buy homes, and that renting promotes character. She claims we'll thank her later when we discover she protected us from becoming house poor. Jake ultimately loses his fury and orders his mother to leave and not return until she is ready to acknowledge what she done. Helen begins weeping, stating she was only trying to assist and that she believed we'd be better with a new start. Jake increases his voice, saying she took our house and must go now. Helen collects her purse and heads to the door, turning back and saying, "We're making a huge mistake getting lawyers involved." She continues, "Lucas is a nice young man and we should just accept the situation." Then she leaves, and Jake strikes the wall hard enough to damage it. I'm holding the baby and trying not to cry while Jake is shivering with fury. He contacts Laura and tells her what happened, and she says she'll come over. She arrives 4 days later with takeaway food and spends hours with us, telling us how their mother has always been like this. The temporary restraining order hearing takes place 3 days after we were due to leave, and the court granted it after considering the evidence of my medical condition and the strange timing. We're in a smaller courtroom than I thought, with only Clara and Lucas, his lawyer, and the judge. The judge is a lady in her 50s who appears exhausted, yet bright. Clara gives all of the documentation, explains the history, and displays images of me in the hospital. She has my medical records, including the bleeding, emergency surgery, and pain meds I was taking. Lucas's lawyer claims that the deal was legal and binding, and that we are simply experiencing buyer's regret. The court asks Lucas directly if he was aware I was in the hospital when the papers were signed, and Lucas responds yes, but this does not invalidate the transaction. When the judge asks if he knew I was using pain medicine, Lucas hesitates and maintains he was unaware of my medical situation. Clara brings out text exchanges between Lucas and Helen, in which Helen clearly says that I recently underwent surgery and am recovering. The judge looks at Lucas coldly, and thinks the timing is questionable at best. She issues the interim restraining order and orders Lucas to cease all remodeling work immediately. However, we are still unable to move back in because the transaction has not been cancelled, only frozen. The court has scheduled a full hearing in 2 weeks to assess if the transaction should be overturned. I'm weeping in the courthouse restroom since this partial triumph means we're still stuck in this cramped apartment with a newborn. Lucas is required to cease all work, although he still legally owns the house. Clara finds me in the restroom and says, "This is actually a really good result." She believes the judge saw through Lucas's falsehoods and that the complete hearing will most likely go our way, but 2 more weeks seems impossible right now. Our money are quickly depleted due to attorney bills and the increased rent on Helen's preferred apartment. And while I'm supposed to be on maternity leave, my nursing supervisor is calling to ask when I'll be back. The apartment is $400 more per month than our mortgage, and we're paying it on top of our usual bills and Clara's costs. Jake sits down with our bank statements and credit cards one night, after the baby has fallen asleep. He puts everything out on the little kitchen table and begins adding figures. We understand we may be able to afford 2 more months of legal bills before we are forced to choose between fighting for our home and meeting basic requirements. My boss keeps calling and inquiring about my return date, and I keep repeating, "I don't know. I'm supposed to have 8 more weeks of vacation, but we need the money." Jake's employment as an IT specialist does not provide enough money to cover everything. We discussed returning to work early, but the baby is just 2 weeks old and I'm still healing from surgery. My boss is understanding, but I can sense the hospital is running out of nurses and is becoming irritated. Jake offers we contact his sister for a loan, but I don't want to. Laura has already been quite helpful to us. We look at credit card offers and personal loans, and they all have ridiculously high interest rates. I start weeping because Helen and Lucas put us in this predicament, and we may have to go into debt to battle them. Jake says we'll work things out, but I can see he's worried too. We resolve to wait until after the next hearing before making any major financial choices. If we lose the house, we'll need money for a security deposit and relocation expenses. If we win, all we need to do is survive until we can move back in. Zachary Hale meets Clara personally and offers to testify about Lucas's fraud habits, bringing documents demonstrating that Lucas particularly targets persons in crisis circumstances who are too overburdened to read papers thoroughly. Clara contacts us the next morning, enthusiastic by Zachary's findings. She claims Zachary has contracts, emails and text messages from other fraud instances that detail Lucas's identical strategy. He seeks people who are going through family issues, medical crises, or financial difficulties and offers to help them. Then he forces them to sign paperwork they don't fully comprehend while distracted and anxious. Zachary lost his life savings in Lucas's prior swindle and has been waiting for an opportunity to see him face the penalties. Clara claims Zachary is willing to testify at the complete hearing, and his evidence might be crucial in establishing this wasn't simply a bungled transaction, but premeditated fraud. She asks if we want to meet with Zachary before the hearing, and we agree. We meet him at a coffee shop near our place. And Zachary is a skinny, jittery man in his 40s who appears to have not slept well in years. He shows us folders full of records and describes how Lucas persuaded him to spend their business savings on a property flip that never occurred. Lucas seized the money and fled, leaving Zachary unable to pay his staff or rent. He lost everything. Zachary adds that when Aaron phoned him about our situation, he saw the pattern right away. He claims Lucas constantly targets persons who are vulnerable and exhausted. He asks about our daughter, and I tell him she's 3 weeks old now. Zachary says, Lucas probably planned the whole thing around my due date knowing we'd be too distracted to fight back. That makes me feel sick because it means this was all calculated from the beginning. I leave the coffee shop with all of Zachary's documents in a folder and my baby sleeping in her carrier against my chest. Jake takes us home, and we both remain quiet since knowing Lucas timed this around my due date makes everything worse. Back at the flat, I nurse the baby and try not to think about Helen watching me labor for 40 hours, knowing exactly what she was planning. My phone rings, and it's Jake's sister Laura, wondering if we'll be attending Thanksgiving at her place next week. I tell her we can't since Helen will be there. Laura says she fully understands. She claims Jake's brother Chris feels the same way and will not go if Helen is invited. However, their other brother, Brian, believes we are exaggerating the situation. Laura claims Brian informed her that moms occasionally overstep, but that is just how Helen is, and we should forgive her. I have to put down the phone for a minute because I am so upset. Laura says she's having Thanksgiving only for us and Chris's family, and Helen isn't invited, till she confesses her mistakes. Jake gets on the phone and thanks his sister, and I can hear him tear a bit. He tells Laura that he never expected to have to choose between his mother and his wife. But Helen made that decision for him when she seized our home. After he hangs up, he sits on our tight apartment couch and looks at the wall. He claims Helen controlled everything during his life, and he never fought her because it was tiresome. He claims he should have safeguarded me better and established limits years ago. I sit next to him, and we don't speak for a long. The baby wakes up sobbing, and I change her diaper on the floor since there isn't enough space in this apartment for a changing table. 4 days later, Clara calls with news of a settlement offer. Lucas's attorney approached her with what they describe as a nice compromise. We'd receive 70% of the house's true worth in cash, and Lucas would keep the property. Clara suggests we should meet in person to discuss this. So we drove to her office with the baby. She lays out papers on her desk that display the figures. The house was valued around $320,000, and Lucas paid $160,000 for it. His offer would bring us $224,000. Clara says that going to trial is expensive, and the outcome is not assured even with all of our proof. She claims trials can last a year or more, and cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal expenses. But if we accept this bargain, Helen and Lucas will get away with taking over $100,000 of my inheritance. I am shaking. I'm so furious. I tell Clara that I want to fight this all the way because they cannot simply take from us and then offer to return the majority of it as if they were doing us a favor. Jake agrees, but seems concerned about the cost. Clara says she understands and believes we have a solid case, but she must be open about the dangers and expenditures. We inform her we're not taking the offer, and she nods and says she'll notify Lucas's attorney. Jake and I discuss money again while driving home. We have about $6,000 in savings after paying Clara's retainer and the first month's rent on this flat. Even if we win the trial, we will be absolutely broke in a year. Jake offers asking his sister for a loan, but I decline because Laura has done so much already. We look at credit card offers and personal loans, and they all have ridiculously high interest rates. I start weeping because Helen and Lucas have gotten us into this problem, and we may have to go into debt to battle them. Jake responds, "We'll figure something out," but I can see he's scared too. The next week, Clara's investigator contacts her with information concerning Helen's finances. Clara joins us at a coffee shop and tells us what he discovered. Helen owes more than $40,000 on credit cards and is facing foreclosure on her condo. The investigator discovered emails between Helen and Lucas dated 6 months earlier, in which they discussed the house selling plan. Lucas offered Helen $25,000 if she helped him acquire the property at half price. Clara offers us printouts of the emails, which I read on my phone while keeping the infant from snatching the papers. Helen wrote, "Things like this will solve both of our problems, and Jake will understand eventually." Lucas' comments focus on timing and ensuring that all documentation seems real. Reading my mother-in-law's comments about snatching my house makes me ill. Clara replies, "This demonstrates Helen wasn't just controlling or making a mistake. She actively planned to commit fraud for money." Jake examines the emails, his hands trembling. He admits he knew his mother was problematic, but he never imagined she'd do something criminal with her own son. Clara argues that this material helps our case greatly by demonstrating preparation and intent. She'll send everything to the district attorney's office to determine whether they'll file criminal charges. When I ask Clara what it implies, she says Lucas and Helen might face fraud charges if the DA believes there is sufficient proof. She reminds us that criminal proceedings move slowly, and there is no assurance of prosecution. However, the fact that a criminal investigation is underway may put Lucas under pressure to negotiate better conditions. 2 weeks later, a detective called our flat and introduced himself as Victor Grant from the district attorney's fraud section. He wants to interview me about what occurred and asks if he may come over. I accept, and he shows up the next afternoon in ordinary clothing, carrying a notepad. The baby is cranky, so I'm attempting to feed her while answering his questions. Detective Grant asks me to go over everything from the beginning. I tell him about Helen's actions during my pregnancy, including handing her the spare key, going into labor, experiencing a hemorrhage, and requiring emergency surgery. When I signed the documents, he took notes and asked specific questions regarding my medical condition. I explained the agony, medicine, and weariness, as well as how I had just completed nursing when the title company representative arrived. He inquires whether Helen was present, and I respond, "Yes, she was standing right there telling me this was what we discussed." Detective Grant seemed troubled as I mentioned signing the paperwork while barely aware. He inquires about Jake's involvement, and I explain how Helen duped him into signing documents he believed were medical power of attorney. The baby begins sobbing loudly, and I have to interrupt the interview to stroll around and quiet her down. Detective Grant waits patiently, explaining that he has children and understands. When I sit back down, he inquires about the emails discovered by Clara's investigator. I tell him Clara has copies of everything, and he says he will obtain them from her. He asks whether I believe Helen arranged this particularly for my due date, and I respond definitely. That's exactly what occurred. She waited till I was most weak to carry out her plan. Detective Grant closes his notes, stating that this is one of the worst incidents of exploitation he has witnessed. He believes that taking advantage of someone shortly after childbirth and emergency surgery is particularly troubling. He assures me that the DA's office will analyze everything and decide on criminal charges within a few weeks. After he goes, I sit on the couch, exhausted. Jake gets home from work, and I tell him about the interview. He asks whether I'm okay, and I respond, "No, I'm really not okay." The stress of everything finally hits me 2 weeks after the detective's visit. I awoke with a severe headache and blurred vision. Jake is preparing for work and I attempt to rise up, but the room swirls. He asks what's wrong, and I explain that I don't feel right. My head is throbbing and I am dizzy. Jake measures my blood pressure with the monitor we received after I left the hospital, and it is dangerously high. He asks his sister to watch the baby and drives me to the emergency department. The emergency room doctor checks me and requests blood tests. She returns an hour later and says, "I'm showing signs of postpartum preeclampsia, and my blood pressure is high enough that I could have a stroke." She adds, "If we'd waited any longer, it could have been really bad." They admit me overnight for monitoring and give me medication to lower my blood pressure. Jake is afraid and repeatedly asks the doctor whether I'll be okay. She believes I should be all right with proper therapy and relaxation, but I need to drastically lower my stress levels. I'm lying in a hospital bed, with an IV in my arm, recognizing that this legal battle is literally jeopardizing my life. The nurse checks my blood pressure every 2 hours during the night, and it gradually decreases. Laura remains at our flat with the baby and sends Jake updates on feedings. In the morning the doctor says I may go home, but I must relax and avoid stress as much as possible. She says postpartum preeclampsia can be dangerous, and I should take it carefully. Jake brings me home and Laura has cleaned our flat and prepared meals. She tenderly holds me and expresses her sorrow at what is occurring. I sleep the most of the day while Laura looks after the baby. When I wake up, Jake is sitting next to the bed, looking afraid. He suggests we accept Lucas' settlement offer since my health is more important than the house. I tell him I will not allow them win after everything they've done. He says he is concerned about losing me, and I respond I will be more cautious. But we are not giving up. My nursing network becomes aware of what occurred to me and the circumstances at home. My co-workers at the hospital begin asking questions, and I end up giving many of them the entire tale. Within days, someone starts an online campaign to aid with our legal bills and living expenses. I am not even sure who initiated it at first. My boss calls and tells me that the whole nursing staff wants to assist, and is circulating the fundraiser link to other departments. I'm ashamed at first since I don't enjoy asking for assistance, but Jake insists we need it. The crowdfunding page tells what Helen and Lucas did and how we're fighting to reclaim our house. Donations begin to pour in from nurses I work with, physicians I've supported during operations, and even patients' relatives who remember me. Within 3 days, more than $3,000 has been raised. By the end of the week, it'll have surpassed $8,000. I'm sobbing as I read the comments from individuals that want to assist and believe what happened to us is terrible. Some nurses I hardly know give $100 or more. My supervisor makes a $500 donation. The fundraising provides us with enough money to continue paying Clara and covering our rent for several months. I contact Clara and inform her that we will not accept Lucas's settlement offer since we can afford to continue battling. She seems relieved and says she was hoping we'd say that since she believes we'll win. My co-workers' support helps me feel less alone and helpless. Jake and I sit down and look at the fundraiser site, reading everyone's lovely remarks. He promises we'll get through this and get our house back. Detective Grant approaches Clara, stating that he needs to question the title company agent who handled the sale. Samantha Brooks is her name, and she is first reluctant to speak with him. Clara informs us that Samantha is concerned about legal liabilities for her firm. Grant receives a court order forcing her to be interrogated, and she eventually accepts. Clara is unable to attend the interview, but Grant later tells her about it. Samantha acknowledged she was concerned about the paperwork timetable because everything transpired so quickly. Lucas pushed her through the procedure, and she didn't push back as much as she could have. She informed Grant that she saw inconsistencies in her internal business files about how quickly things were signed and processed. Normally, a house sale takes weeks, but this one took only days. Samantha stated that Lucas pressed her to shut things promptly, and she agreed because he was a returning client. Grant inquired whether she saw anything strange about my signature, and Samantha stated the paperwork were valid at the time, but the timing was peculiar. Clara argues that Samantha's testimony is significant because it demonstrates that even the title firm suspected something was off with the deal. Her internal notes on inconsistencies will indicate Lucas was aware he was doing anything improper. Grant informs Clara that Samantha's assistance greatly improves the criminal case. The district attorney's office is now seriously investigating fraud charges against Lucas and Helen. Clara phones us 2 weeks later with big news. She claims that the criminal probe has become substantial enough that Lucas's counsel is now concerned about jail time. Grant has created a case that demonstrates Lucas's practice of deception against several victims, including Zachary Hale. The emails between Lucas and Helen show that they planned the entire affair together. Samantha's evidence reveals that Lucas hastened the transaction despite knowing it was dubious. All of the information about my medical condition and the fake paperwork indicates that this was a premeditated deception against a vulnerable individual. Clara claims Lucas's attorney contacted her to arrange a fresh settlement on our terms, rather than their prior lowball offer. Lucas's power has radically altered since he is facing criminal fraud accusations, which might result in actual prison time. Helen is being examined as an accomplice since the emails show she was part in the planning process. Clara claims that this is the first time she has truly believed that we will reclaim our home. Lucas's attorney wants to meet to negotiate conditions, and Clara believes they would agree to nearly anything to keep Lucas from going to trial on criminal charges. When I ask Clara what Helen is facing, she replies that if the DA charges her as an accomplice, she might face probation, community service and reparations. Jake seemed relieved for the first time in months. We set up a meeting with Lucas's attorney for the next week to negotiate settlement terms. After 3 weeks of back and forth with our attorneys, we eventually reach an agreement. Lucas will return the house to us and put the deed back into my name. He will pay for all of our legal bills, including Clara's and the investigators. He will pay for our move back into the house, as well as $18,000 in compensation for damages and lost equity. In addition to returning the home, Lucas must pay us around $40,000 in total. It's not perfect since we'll never be able to recoup the 4 months of rent we paid for this place, let alone the mental pain of what we went through. But the most important thing is that we have our house back. Lucas has pleaded guilty to fraud charges, which result in 2 years probation and reparations to his other victims, including Zachary Hale. He will not serve jail time, but he will have a criminal record and must repay everyone he scammed. Clara claims that the DA consented to probation instead of prison time since Lucas is cooperating and returning our house. We sign the settlement papers in Clara's office, and I'm trembling the entire time. Jake squeezes my hand and says, "We did it." After all of the paperwork is processed via the court system, the house will be returned to my name within 2 weeks. Helen's criminal case continues forward independently of Lucas's settlement with us. The DA accuses her as an accomplice to fraud based on emails indicating that she arranged everything with Lucas. She faces probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $12,000 reparation payment for her involvement in the fraud. Clara argues that Helen's penalty is less harsh than Lucas's, since she did not immediately gain from the transaction, as Lucas never paid her the $25,000 he promised. The DA is treating her as a facilitator of the fraud, rather than the primary culprit. But she's still getting a criminal record and must repay us. The $12,000 restitution is in addition to Lucas's settlement, bringing the total payout to $30,000. Helen loses the $25,000 Lucas promised her, and her financial condition worsens instead of improving. Laura informs us that Helen had to sell her condo to escape foreclosure and is now relocating into a modest apartment. Her credit card debt remains, and she now faces further court bills. I don't enjoy seeing her suffer, but there is justice in how her selfishness and cruelty backfired totally. She attempted to take my fortune, but ended up losing everything herself. The moving truck arrives on a Saturday morning, 5 months after we signed the settlement documents. And I stood in our driveway, holding my daughter, who has grown so much since that dreadful day when we returned home to discover everything changed. Jake pulls boxes through the front door, which Lucas never had the time to fix. I accompany him inside to the living room, where Lucas began taking down the carpet but never completed. We spend the first day simply strolling through each area and choosing what has to be repaired, cleaned, or discarded from Lucas's half-finished repairs. The nursery still has the color I picked before everything fell apart, and I sit in it with my daughter, crying a bit because we are finally home. Jake finds me there and sits down next to us on the floor, wrapping his arm over my shoulders without saying anything for a few minutes. Then he talks about his mother and how he should have known what she was capable of. How his devotion to her blinded him to all the warning indicators that were there in front of him. He apologizes for disbelieving me when I originally informed him there was a problem with the papers, and for waiting 3 days to truly realize his mother had stolen our home. We chatted for nearly an hour about what our family would look like in the future, about boundaries and trust, and how we will safeguard our daughter from others who pretend to love her but treat her cruelly. It hurts to have this talk because Jake is grieving for the mother he believed he had before understanding she was never that person. And I am seeing my husband's grief, even if I am pleased that he has finally realized the truth. The next week, Jake calls his mother from our bedroom while I am in the hallway, where I can hear everything. He informs Helen that she can visit her granddaughter but only under supervision and after completing a family therapy program centered on boundaries and restoring shattered trust. Helen instantly begins arguing that she does not require treatment, that she was simply trying to assist us, and that we are being unkind and ungrateful. Jake remains cool and repeats the requirements without giving in or allowing her guilt trip to affect him. She threatens to fight for grandparents' rights, which Jake says is a poor idea considering her recent felony conviction for fraud. Helen begins weeping, claiming Jake is choosing me over his own mother, and he says that he has chosen his wife and daughter since that is what a husband and father do. Helen hangs up on him, and Jake emerges from the bedroom, fatigued but lighter in spirit. I tell him I'm proud of him for prioritizing our nuclear family, and he hugs me tightly, saying he should have done so years ago. 6 months after Lucas changed our locks and Helen devastated our lives, we've settled into a routine that feels almost normal. Our daughter is crawling around and gets into everything. And now that we've repaired all of the damage from Lucas's renovations, the house seems like our own again. Jake's connection with his mother is only maintained through infrequent supervised video conversations in which Helen refuses to recognize she did anything wrong. And I know their relationship will most likely never heal. However, his sister comes over twice a week to help with the baby. And his brother, who stood with us through everything, has become one of our best friends. Instead of pretending Helen's poisonous control was normal or appropriate, we're putting together the family support system we really need. My coworkers still check in with me on a daily basis to see how things are doing, and the nursing supervisor granted my Desire to return part-time so I could spend more time with my baby. I'm now working 3 days a week, and we're steadily paying off the credit card debt we accumulated throughout the court battle. We are not where we were financially before Helen sold our house, and it will take another year to return to that stability, but we are going ahead, and our daughter is thriving in the home purchased with my grandfather's fortune, which was always the goal of battling so hard to reclaim it. I've learned that safeguarding your family often entails facing fights you never expected to confront, standing up to those who should love you but chose to be unkind instead. I'm stronger for having survived this horror, even if I wish it had never occurred. And I know I can handle whatever happens next, because I've already survived the worst-case scenario I could have imagined.